This week, Emmet and I review the Stan Lee memoir graphic novel Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible by Stan Lee, Peter David, and Colleen Doran. Also, in honor of our 700th episode, I go back in the vault for a few clips from classic episodes. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. My brother Paul and I, hosts of To the Batpoles podcast, have been doing bi-weekly videos available to all patrons of TV trivia from the late 20th century. More perks and bonus content at higher donation levels, including our ongoing full-length podcast on 1960s Spider-Man comics. And help us meet our goals to unlock the earliest episodes of the podcast and put all the episodes back in the feed. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
And this is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics, episode 700. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet in country Victoria, Australia,
That's where we're going
out
with.
among the
Yes.
kangaroos. Yes. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Tim. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are continuing our trek through all the books about Stan Lee, including the ones written, or at least credited to, Stan Lee himself. And we were going to go next to Excelsior, The Amazing Life of Stan Lee, which is a memoir of his, a prose memoir, apparently mostly actually written by George Mayer. But it's kind of a hard book to get. It's not available electronically, as far as we could tell. We both had to try to order it and wait a surprisingly long time to receive it. Mine got damaged in the mail the first time, and they had to send me a replacement. So I think it's been about a month that I've been waiting for this book. Finally got here today.
Mine got redirected to the wrong town. Then had to go all the way back to Melbourne and then come back to me again. And I've been joking with Tim that the comic book gods don't want us to read this book.
Yeah.
It's been kept away from us, but we finally both have our copies. We can do the research now.
So while we were waiting, we decided to do a book that I already had on hand, and I think you did too?
Yes, I'd recently got a hold of it, yeah.
This was sent to me by Adam, who's been helping with critiquing comics recently. He had one that he didn't need anymore, so he just mailed it to me from Nagoya. So it's been sitting here for a while, actually, before I started reading it. It's called Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible, a Marvelous Memoir by Stan Lee and Peter David and Colleen Doran. So always has to have his name first, no matter how much he actually contributed to it.
Yes, I mean, he is the substance of this graphic novel. It's about Stan Lee. It's told in his voice again, supposedly.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is very much a product of Peter David, and there are little quirks. If you're familiar with Peter David's work in comics, certainly, there are certain quirks that emerge in the telling and the framing of the story that are very Peter David-y.
What did you notice?
Well, there was a slight... Okay, so my relationship with Peter David goes back to the early 90s when I discovered that you could read Star Trek novels that were actually funny. And this is something he actually credits himself with as well. I've read interviews with him where he was talking about, people told me how funny my Star Trek novels were, and I said, wait, the one where the empathic alien gets horribly murdered and breaks Deanna Troy's heart and all this, and it's true. Peter David's work also happens to feature a lot of trauma. And depression is a recurring theme. Suicide is a recurring theme. But he also credits himself as being quite funny. So there's lots of yuck type humor in the mix as well. It's a heady mix. So when you've got that kind of approach to telling a story, somebody who's not afraid to really explore the dark themes as well as be humorous, you've got somebody who's got a great deal of ambition. And one feature of his writing is a breaking of the fourth wall. Characters will address the reader or call attention to the telling of the story as you're reading the story. And this begins with Stan Lee addressing a crowd. He jumps through a canvas sheet almost like he's punching his way through the page of the comic you're reading. But he's addressing a crowd, and then he clearly starts addressing us. And then he controls the story that we're reading. So the gimmick is that the sequence of events that we're reading are Stan Lee's own trip down memory lane. He thinks of something and then he goes to that memory. So he's skipping through time. And a lot of it's told out of sequence as a result.
It's kind of chronological, except not really, because he'll jump ahead to like the Harry Osborn drug issues of Spider-Man and then jump back to where he was in the story.
Yes. And, I'm just looking at the page where he's talking about going to see the Errol Flynn Adventures of Robin Hood at the cinema, and he starts inserting his own childhood self into the romance with Maid Marian. And this is idea of, you can see through the way Peter David and Colleen Doran have laid out this page that there's this insertion of the child into the cinema image. So there's all sorts of things like that, little tricks of calling attention to the medium, calling attention to memory. That's something Peter David is likely to do. It's not really something I would associate with Stan Lee as much, where I feel like when we're talking about a Stan Lee written project, it's usually somebody, he's talking to us from on high. There's always this sense of him talking from a height. He's a storyteller talking down to us. David likes to jump around a lot. And there are a couple of moments in this that I frankly was a little baffled by the choices made, the allusions made. But I do think the overall approach of this comic, this graphic novel, is to strongly associate Stan Lee with the successes of Marvel and strongly associate him with the movie successes of Marvel Entertainment, while still representing POW Entertainment, which at the time was a going concern when this is published. So
when you're talking about some of the choices, are you thinking about, to me, like the weirdest sequence in here was when he's talking about Jack Kirby moving to DC, and it just kind of, every day talking about it, but the images are like Jack Kirby moving through some kind of interdimensional portal or something going to DC. And it just felt really weird to me because, it was the pictures were a completely different tone than the text was.
I mean, that's leaning on Kirby's New Gods with the boom tube technology. So that's the significance of that. That Kirby is jumping to the New Gods universe, which he publishes through DC. But you're right, that's very much a Peter David detail in terms of citing that within this work. I don't think New Gods would really rate in Stan Lee's reflections on his former collaborator. No, the page I'm thinking of, the one that really just baffled me, was there is a recurring motif of the owners of Marvel being a company represented as a building, and then that building's destroyed or the sign for that building is replaced. So the corporate overlords keep changing and shifting. And towards the end of the book, there's a sequence where they get bought out by Ron Perlman. And then there's a reference to Ron Perlman. And in his guise as the Beast from that 1980s romantic horror fantasy series, Beauty and the Beast.
Okay, I saw that and it didn't make the reference was lost on me and like
exactly.
What?
Exactly. exactly my point. It's an interesting show. I grew up watching it. I remember it well. It also featured the writing of one George R. R. Martin. I believe it's one of his early credits as a television writer. So it's a reference that I recognize, but it's a reference that I imagine a lot of people don't recognize. And if you're going to make the Ron Perlman comparison, you could just feature the face of the actor. He's a very well-known actor. Or you could feature the face of the actor in character as Hellboy. We know him from Hellboy. Like, it's a silly joke, but like, that would have more currency, I think, than a show he did with Linda Hamilton almost 40 years ago. It's a very odd choice, and that's the one and I was going, that's Peter David. That's obscure enough for it to be Peter David. I think that's it. So yeah, it's two people representing the way Stan Lee would maybe account for himself, but their own choices are what makes this interesting. At times, there's a sense of them having fun with a meandering narrative and drawing in their own influences or their own likes and dislikes into the mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned making him responsible for the successes of Marvel, and also, of course, I mean, you kind of would expect in an autobio, especially a Stan Lee autobio, any type of most of failures in his life are really glossed over. Stan Lee Media gets one panel where he just basically says the less said about it, the better, he says, and then they just move on.
Yes, and because they're successful, X-Men gets a couple of pages in terms of representing how important X-Men are to Marvel and the X-Men are to the success of Marvel. And again, Lee's involvement in X-Men, the fact that he couldn't call it the mutants, he had to be the X-Men because no one knows what a mutant is. But instead of crediting, say, Len Wein or Chris Claremont or Grant Morrison or
John Byrne,
any other John Byrne, thank you, any other people who've come along afterwards, he chooses to cite the work of one Bryan Singer, has since fallen in the world somewhat in terms of but yeah, there's little things like that where I'm going, this is the thing we keep bringing up in our conversation with Stan Lee, but he's fixed onto the movies as the demarcator of success. That's the thing to call attention to. So that was interesting to me. And did you spot the Peter David cameo?
No.
So there's a sequence where we're jumping around to this much the same way as this itself. Dear listener, this is what reading this feels like. It's a lot of jumps and skips in time. There's a sequence, a very well-known story, I think we've all heard it, where Stan Lee talks about the No Prize, the origins of the No Prize, where people write in and they'd point out continuity errors, and then you go, oh, congratulations, here's a No Prize. You win nothing, but you win the kudos of being addressed, if you like, from the letter column. So we have a sequence where a special delivery is received by a young boy. It's congratulations. This envelope contains a genuine Marvel Comics No Prize, which you have just won. And it's just to Peter David. Or David is slightly obscured, but it's clearly Peter David.
Finger is over part of the word. By the way, I wanted to mention, I mean, it's kind of appropriate that we're doing this in a big round number episode of this podcast because, I mean, something about this book that harks back to the old days of this podcast when we would complain, this book has no page numbers.
Oh, God.
Which is, the bane of the reviewer, especially reviewing on a podcast where I would usually say it's on page whatever. But so I had to resort to putting sticky notes in my book pointing out, certain pages that I wanted to have handy while recording. So, there are a lot of, like you said, familiar stories in here. I was kind of noticing the stories that we had not seen in either of the bios. So, we have nothing to compare them to. I had never heard this story about Wortham being shocked at, Frederick Wortham being shocked at this giraffe in a cage in some comic book and saying that it was a sexual suggestion.
Right. Now, I do recall something like that. Maybe it wasn't from the bios, but that's not Wortham. That's the politician that he's propping Wortham up for his campaign. That might be in the Sean, the Marvel Untold Story of Marvel. Was it Sean?
Sean Howe.
Sean Howe. Thank you. It might be in the Sean Howe book.
Well, in here, I'm not sure who's giving the speech here, but he says...
No, it's not clear.
Dr. Wortham considers this one especially appalling. Notice, if you will, the sexual suggestion, the long, hard neck extended through the hole. Children clearly know what is going on here. So, yeah, I'm not sure who's speaking. It's not Wortham, but he's talking about Wortham's opinion.
Yeah, and that's an unusual sequence. But what we do have from the bios was that Lee would talk up his supposed rivalry with Wortham. That they'd had a debate.
Yeah,
yes.
I did not see that in this book, but yeah,
that's not here. But
he's been quoted as saying that elsewhere, although there's no evidence. I had not heard the story about being at the White House during the Carter administration and the guy in the Green Goblin costume scaring Amy Carter.
Yeah. Again, I wonder how much of that is
right. Well, I mean, I'm just sprinkling salt all over this book. After all of the stuff that we've read in the other two books,
it is interesting though to that he cites Carter, because I mean Carter was deeply unpopular for a segment of the population. So there is a sort of dismissive summary of Carter in that little anecdote where he says, he probably wanted me to promote some environmental thing, which again is a hint at Lee's own politics, this idea of how silly, how stupid. Famously, the Carter administration, they had solar panels on the roof of the White House, and then when I think it was Reagan got in, Reagan immediately took them off, took them down. I'm still obsessed with that Ron Perlman Beauty and the Beast reference. Just blowing my brain.
There's also a story about Stan having dinner with Bob Kane, and Bob Kane apparently giving a sketch of Batman as a tip to the waiter.
Yes. So this is fascinating. So
yeah, because I feel like Stan is kind of making the same accusations against Bob Kane that the other bios are making against Stan.
Yes, exactly. And is that the tellers of this story, the endorsed tellers of this Stan Lee story, poking fun at him? Because in the sequence, he's just got done telling an anecdote to Kane, more or less breezily summarizing how he's driving his staff at Marvel crazy with his demands over Iron Man needing to have a nose.
Yeah.
There's a whole story about Iron Man needing to have a nose, and it causes a ruction. And so he's telling this story, and it's clearly being played for laughs, but there's also this sense of you are unnecessarily interfering with the creative work of this company. That's the upshot of that story. And then Bob Kane famously takes more credit than he's due.
Yeah.
For both the invention of Batman and then for the continuing work on Batman, where he had a stable of ghost artists working on his behalf. So he draws this crappy little Batman figure on a napkin and gives it to a waiter after demanding the waiter acknowledge him as the creator of Batman.
Yeah, he says, "I'm Bob Kane." The waiter says, "Who?"
Yeah. And then like in this same accounting of Stan Lee's life, we've got incidents like with him saying, and we mentioned this last time we did this Stan Lee series, you have the incident with Hillary Clinton, where he introduces Joan to Hillary Clinton as his trophy wife, and then they meet again, and she's, and here's your trophy wife, and she says, she remembers.
I'm important. Hillary Clinton remembers who I am.
Yeah. It's, oh.
Oh, another story that was new to me was about how supposedly when he was in the army, he almost got arrested for mail robbery because he picked the lock on his own mailbox trying to get it a letter for him that he couldn't get otherwise because the post office was closed.
Yeah. Now, again, this is, we can assume, a story told for comic effect, and the
Yeah.
story is rendered just to emphasize that with him suddenly being transformed into wearing a convict's uniform.
Yeah.
So there's this clear playing for laughs, and then his superior intercedes on his behalf, goes, "Oh, we can't afford to lose him as a writer," which again, they had plenty of writers in the propaganda unit. That wasn't an issue for them. So it's been told for comic effect. But like, we also know from those biographies that he was steadily getting work from Marvel while he was there. Like, he was corresponding. He was, he had a stand-in working on his behalf in the office, but he was able to continue writing during that time. So that, there wasn't any real issue there.
No.
I do wonder how much of, because this is also a book promoting POW as the next phase in Stan's creative career. Mr. Peter Paul, if you look him up, he features on his wiki page Hillary Clinton's photo. So there seems to be a bit of obsession there. He's not involved with POW, correct? Because he was Stan Lee Media, and
he was. That's right.
Yeah, but the Clintons seem to figure large in their attention.
Well, talking about POW Entertainment, I was noticing the choice of words. So he goes on and on about characters we've created. Not that they're successful in any way. I mean, they exist. Were they ever even published? But we created these characters. But no one's ever seen them, probably. Nobody ever will again. And he talked about Stripperella, which did, we at least appear. But talk about trying to put the best face forward. We created
I do remember Soldier Zero, but I remember Soldier Zero because Paul Cornell, I think, worked with him on it. And it's funny, I was listening to a podcast called Big Mouth. It's a British-based pop culture podcast, and they were reviewing Disney's Loki series. And the person on the panel launched into, before she started talking about Loki, she's like, "Oh, I really like that other Stan Lee show, Lucky Man." Now, have you ever heard of Lucky Man?
No.
Right, so Lucky Man was made in the UK, and it stars a Northern Irish actor as the principal role, and Stan Lee's name is emblazoned all over it. It was a Stan Lee thing. I think it came out of this same stable, and they had their fingers in so many pies. And the sequence you've mentioned, you've got the few different comics like Stripella and Soldier Zero, and then you've got the
Starborn and The Traveler,
the comics from other cultures. So they're going to other countries and they're saying, "Oh, Stan Lee will produce a comic concept based in your culture, like if it's Japanese culture or Indian culture." We're trying to get a foothold in these countries as well. So they were doing lots of things, like the Lucky Man series, which this person on the podcast remembers. I haven't heard anyone else ever talk about it before. I remember it coming out. I remember it existing. But like all these other POW products, they came out, they were there, and then they weren't there. They simply passed beneath our notice. I'm fascinated that Just Imagine gets a decent airing in here, which is the time DC let Stan Lee reimagine some of their characters, and I think that was that was another one where here obviously it's presented as, oh, I'm doing all these comics for DC. I'm working for the Distinguished Competition finally, and they've asked me to do my take on Superman or my take on Aquaman. He also did. There was a Batman book. There was a Wonder Woman book, which was a lot like Promethea. There was a couple of books that came out. I think there was like 2 rounds of Just Imagine Stan Lee, but it's widely known that there were ghostwriters on all of those.
Okay, that figures.
Yeah, people were sort of, oh yeah, sure, look, I'll do it.
And I didn't really understand why Michael Uslan was shown in a 66 Batmobile inviting Stan to write DC Comics. I mean, Michael Uslan, I don't think he ever worked for DC. I mean, he produced Batman movies, but...
He owns Batman, basically, right? That's the whole significance of that. And I think it's because he sees himself as the arbiter of what Batman gets to be on the big screen. Because he hated the Adam West series so much. He reacted to the Adam West series by saying, no, that's too camp. Batman has to be dark, foreboding, and grim. And hence, all the things since then he got the rights have his name on them. Because he supposedly is that line.
Well, but if he doesn't like 66 Batman, it's interesting. He's sitting in a 66 Batmobile in this comic.
Is that another Peter David joke? Like,
perhaps.
I don't know. Bit of a stinger, bit of a sting in the tail.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we touch on the Steve Ditko departure sequence?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of my notes is like, that's certainly not the story that was told in the bios. Maybe the story that Lee was quoted as giving in the bios, but then contradicted by Reisman and by Spurgeon and Raphael. Yeah, well, so Ditko leaves and Kirby leaves, and Stan is all like, I don't know why he left. He never told me any reason. It's always like, I had nothing to do with it. I have no idea why. And I'm just... I wouldn't want to believe he was so self-unaware, but he's acting like he was.
Well, even from the Spider-Man comics we've reviewed, there have been sort of textual references to this sort of struggle over the creative ownership of the title. Steve wants more credit, does he? And like he's playing it for laughs, but it's still this sense of resentment. No, this is a sequence which... You called attention to Kirby jumping through a boom tube to escape Marvel to DC. This is also strangely surreal in terms of Stan Lee. It's sad Stan Lee talking about, we had internal problems, starting with Steve Ditko. He just didn't seem happy working with me anymore. He's very sad about this. And then over a sequence of 4 panels, we see Steve Ditko sitting at his desk in the office, slowly being erased.
Yeah, just from fading away.
There's erasure strips, like pulling away, and he eventually he's just not there anymore.
Yeah, just the chair.
But despite that, by 1966. I'm sorry to say he was gone. And then we jump straight into, but John Romita was here and he could draw women. Look at Mary Jane. It's oh, sorry. And then the following page is the weird sequence of Kirby. It's such an odd little moment in the book because it's sad. It's genuinely sad. And it's very evocative. The sense that the art has been erased. But it's unusually ambitious visually. And it sort of draws attention to the making of a comic book page and how you erase things. And that was the job that Stan Lee had when he worked for Simon and Kirby, erasing the lines off the page. So there is something quite interesting about it, but at the same time, it's weirdly affected too. It's like, what? It's sort of giving weight to his... sort of, I don't know, something happened and it was over, I guess. Moving on.
And I was really, I don't know. So, right after the page that shows the cover of Fantastic Four #1, there's this whole kind of ode to Jack Kirby, and if I felt like if Stan had given this much recognition to Jack at the time, he wouldn't have left. It's easy to praise him now. By the time this was written, Jack had died. And then also, the same thing happens with Larry Lieber, Stan's brother. And, Riesman in particular was quoting Lieber saying all these things about how Stan had slighted him. This is quite a contrast to that when he says, Larry Lieber is one of the unsung heroes of comicdom, a terrific writer, layout man, and artist. He does his work quietly, efficiently, and beautifully. In his career, he's written and drawn almost every type of strip and done them flawlessly.
Yes, and there's this sort of, again, evocative page of him smiling, Larry Lieber smiling at us. But he also is mentioned as abandoning Marvel for Atlas when Goodman tries to dress up his rival comic book line. And we know that he actually went to Stan, more or less, asked permission or checked before he did it. But that is mentioned here. It is mentioned that he took off. He went with the betrayers, saboteurs. What did you think of the depiction of Goodman in this?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like Goodman was almost J. Jonah Jameson in here. He's this boss who is just kind of impossible on some points. Won't let Stan do what he wants to do. Goodman gets blamed for not being able to return original art. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
Stan, it wasn't my fault. I would have returned original art, but Martin Goodman said no. But then we had that report in the Riesman book that a lot of it apparently ended up in Stan's possession rather than in Marvel's possession, which you would assume that that became Marvel property and Marvel would have stored it somewhere.
Yeah, and you can, as we talked about before, you can potentially negotiate with a legally bound corporation. Now, it could be expensive, it could be long and arduous, it could be quite painful, but it's a corporation, whereas some guy like just hiding them away in a cubbyhole somewhere, they're gone. That's it, they're gone. You don't get them. It's interesting. He also simply departs the story, and we know that it was quite an acrimonious split.
Yeah, well, we got to the Atlas part, and it's like, what? He left? I had missed that.
Yeah.
That dialogue box.
Yeah, and then Atlas is just gone.
Right. Yeah, Atlas comes and goes in one page. And then Goodman's out of the book after that. But yeah, I mean, so often, not just in the I don't know why he left, he never told me anything, but he's always kind of gee whiz shucks about a lot of things. So we're talking about the origins of Spider-Man and Hulk. He's like, well, I have no idea what gamma rays are, but it sure sounds scientific. There's all this analysis about how the early Marvel heroes' origins, show this, public concern about, changes in science and new developments and radiation and all this. And Stan's just like, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sure what to make of that. Is he maybe not taking enough credit for something here, or is he just kind of trying to make this image of being like nothing is, I don't know, nothing is really weighty for him. I mean, there are weighty points in the book, though, but I don't know. What did you make of that?
Are we talking about the sequence where he's talking about how to write the Hulk, or how to?
Well, I think when he's talking about the origin of the Hulk, and I think also Spider-Man, he's. Let's see. I can't give you a page number.
This is the problem. I'll find it.
But yeah, just before the page with the cover of Hulk #1, he's with, who is this? I guess this is Goodman. Lee says, "I'll have him get hit by the rays of a gamma bomb." Goodman, "What are gamma rays?" Stan, "No idea, but you got to admit they sound good." So like he's just like picking up these words that don't really mean anything to him just because it'll sound right in the comic. Never mind what it actually means.
But it is playing into the idea of him being touched by genius.
Mm-hmm.
That he's free associating these things. He's got these alliterative names. He's having these moments of inspiration, and then it's sort of like working back from the end product. We know The Incredible Hulk is this really successful comic. We know that it's this Frankenstein's monster meets Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of transformation. We're familiar with the Hulk as a pop culture figure, so he now has to deconstruct that from his own invention, saying, "Oh no, that was all me. I did that." So that's what this is all about. He's like, now who genuinely knows how many steps were involved in that creative process? How many other parties maybe had a word? Maybe this was a script that existed in the bottom of a shelf in the previous 10 years that didn't get touched. Because the thing about the Hulk as well is the Hulk is an unusual Marvel concept in that it reads like a horror comic. It is a horror comic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the successes of the Immortal Hulk series that Al Ewing has been writing recently is it really channels that energy again. It's like, no, this is horror. This is actually horror. It's not a superhero story. It's a story about loss of self and violence and death. And I'm wondering if the Hulk was something that was originally created for a horror magazine in the 50s and it just got recycled. And, after the fact, then it sort of gets retooled as, no, it's actually a superhero story. But the real importance of this sequence with Lee talking to Goodman about Hulk and Spider-Man is that it's showing Lee acting out, jumping around the room, which apparently he did do. But what I wonder is how much of that is performative. How much of that is the invented character Stan Lee for the sake of, say, somebody passing through the office or somebody visiting or a journalist. This performance is there to give you the sense of a genius. Whereas the picture that's been emerging more and more over the years is he was taking a lot of credit for other people's labor.
Yeah.
Creative work. Martin Goodman here is a suit, a stiff. He doesn't get it.
Yeah.
He needs to be worked on, and Stanley will always get his way, and then he's right. He's successful, and we all love him.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way to describe it than J. Jonah Jameson. Yeah, he's a suit. Yeah.
Well, I liked your Jameson. I liked your Jameson comparison because then we have the success of Spider-Man, where he comes bursting through the door like a sort of manga chibi type character with dollar signs over his eyes, and he's going, the numbers on Amazing Fantasy are huge. This may be the best-selling comic book of all time, and Stan Lee is like low-key furious.
Yeah. After Goodman had been talking, trying to discourage publishing Spider-Man at all, then when it's successful, then he's got dollar signs in his eyes.
But that same page, we have the Lee sort of talking about how he wanted to do a Thor comic, And he said, "Oh yes, well, I love Norse mythology, and I thought this is made perfect sense. We could do a Thor comic. And who is the most tragic and heroic Norse god of them all? Thor, And but Kirby disputes this. Kirby saying, no, I was going to do a Thor book for DC or National, whatever it was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
He already had it in the works, and they just retooled it for Marvel when it got to having to flood the market with all these Marvel books. So, who do you believe?
Yeah. Coming up, making readers like Tony Stark, the 90s speculation market, the recording of the Merry Marvel Marching Society record, and I play a few classic clips from past episodes. Don't forget you can help to unlock classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics, help me return all the old episodes to the podcast feed, and at the $4 level get access to hours of additional full-length podcasts. At the $10 level, you can review the book of your choice with me here on this show. Support Deconstructing Comics and our other shows at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or you can send a one-time donation via PayPal to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
Another example of being kind of gosh gee whiz is when he starts talking about the college campus speeches, and he says, and very often I was even paid.
Yes, that was rough.
Yeah, like you didn't decide how much you wanted. They just, here, have some money.
But the feat of clay in that sequence is that he looks too formal to be around the kids, so he's wearing a suit. So then he'll rock up in a t-shirt and jeans and torn jeans, and he'll be invited along to the dean's manse or whatever, for a private dinner party with all these other tuxedoed worthies. So yeah, it's he introduces the fact that he was getting paid to do college appearances, and that these appearances probably did a lot to cement his popularity as a public figure, and also generate more interest in Marvel. But then he sort of leads you off that path by going, and then there's this funny incident where I turned up to a cocktail party wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Can you believe it, kids? Like that's that's where this actually works as a interpretation of Stan Lee, if you like. I can see David and Doran translating their impressions of the Stan Lee huckster figure, the man who apparently just had boundless enthusiasm, who just could talk and talk and talk. And have you watched that footage of him doing I think it was some sort of show he had with Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane?
I don't think I've seen that.
So they're the new kids on the block. They're doing their thing, and they have to create a character. And Stan Lee's like sort of talking them through the process of creating this character. I think the character's called Overkill. And there's this sequence where you can see Stan Lee's just talking and talking and talking, and they love him. If you watch the footage, they love him, and he screws up at one point. Like he says something, and it's just wrong. And Liefeld, who's a bit bamboozled by him at times, covers for him. Like he rolls with it and he goes, "Oh yeah, of course I know what you mean. This." And it's interesting to watch because I wonder how much generosity Lee would have for somebody who messed up. If the reverse were true. because like Goodman kind of gets, I mean, I think, written up here as somewhat inhumane. And Kirby has no personality beyond his willingness to create. I love the Doran's gimmick of him having Kirby crackle coming out of his cigars all the time. It's a cute little bit. But like he's basically a creature of Lee's, and then he leaves for some reason. We don't know why. Dicko leaves for some reason. We don't know why. The people who are inconvenient simply get dismissed from this. There's no reckoning, and there's no accountability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. After your Deconstructing Comics episode about Iron Man recently, I was interested in Stan in here showing the creation of Iron Man, saying he'll be a billionaire industrialist, the quintessential capitalist, and I'll try to find a way to make our readers like him.
Yes. Now he has talked about that. Like I think we. I had a discussion with Dr. Matt Finch about Iron Man and how the framing of Iron Man has changed from him being this arch capitalist to what people call a futurist, which is a confused idea, let's just say. And Tim has published the episode this week at the time of recording, and you can go listen to it.
So it'll be 2 episodes before this one. Plus there'll be a Critiquing Comics in there, but yeah. So June 16th episode. Yeah.
So I was familiar with Stan's version of this story. And yeah, he's trying to, it's sort of introduced here as him trying to get the hippies on side. That he's the free marketplace of ideas or something like that. You have Goodman disbelievingly say, "You want your next hero to be a military industrialist?" Exactly, says Stan. Again, as written by Peter David, like this conversation never took place. But it is interesting to reflect on that again. That they chose to create this character in this particular period, given the anti-war protests, given the youth movements, given the sense of the policies of the time. They chose to create Iron Man specifically with this agenda. And I would, contrast that with Kirby's, Forever People, the New Gods, and all these ideas where he's trying to channel the potentiality of the youth movements from the 60s. And he's saying, well, where could this lead? What does this mean? Shouldn't we be encouraging this sort of revolutionary ethos a bit more? Shouldn't we be trying to call out the fascist elements within society and celebrate the youth movements that are trying to find a better way? Stan Lee's idea for Iron Man is he's a weapons industrialist who maybe doesn't kill people as much.
And he has a heart problem.
And he's got a heart problem and a drinking problem. Although I think that was more after
the drinking problem was like, I don't think that appeared until the late 70s.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, you're right. You are right. But I think he introduced he had the character of Tony Stark, but then he introduced a love triangle and everything into the story. He was very, by rote Stan Lee character. But yeah, the framing of him as a conservative figure, if you like, to be made somehow sympathetic. He's taken captive by the Vietnamese, by the Viet Cong, and he has to escape creating this suit of armor, and then he becomes a superhero. That's a really the question I would ask there is, okay, what's the agenda here? What's he trying to get across the line here? What's he trying to convince the reader of? What's going on? But yeah, here in this telling, it's framed as Stanley looking to creatively challenge himself by getting young people read a comic about a weapons manufacturer.
We're talking about how David and Doran represented some things. I liked the part about the 80s and 90s comic speculation. The guy with the long boxes stacked on a forklift. And driving into a comic shop, and then he can't get any money for them, so he dumps the forklift and all into a pond.
Yeah, I actually witnessed. Like you've been to signings like where people do things like that, where they bring in like a box of comics for the creator to sign. Like, what are you doing? What's this? Yeah, but I think that was an interesting time as well, because sort of Lee was very much in his Hollywood era at that point.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how aware he was of what was going on in the speculation market, but it certainly wasn't something like Marvel. I think the comic industry likes to blame individual speculators for the sins of the speculation market. But I remember the 90s. I remember the 90s, Tim, and I remember how much they really banged on about issue number 1. Buy this issue number 1. It'll sure to be a fan favorite.
Yeah, and
first appearance of character X.
Yeah, and as the book itself here notes, there were too many copies available of each comic for them to be worth much of anything as like an investment. So he goes to that comic shop, and there's a sign up saying we buy Golden Age comics only.
Yeah, it's old comics are valuable because they were rare, but publishers have been producing millions of copies of new titles. Yeah. There is an entertaining moment earlier where a kid is reading a classic edition of Action Comics, the first appearance of Superman, and Stan Lee. So the Stan Lee avatar simply snatches it off the kid and throws it over his shoulder. Oh, don't worry, it's worthless.
And I noticed the several pages, I think, that were devoted to this recording of the MMMS record with members of the bullpen, which, I think it was Riesman talks about how Kirby said that it was scripted and they practiced a lot, and Stan says, including in this book, that it was all ad-libbed, and they're just having a good old time in the recording studio.
Oh yeah, but like that's something that we can hear. We can actually hear it. We can track down copies of this, and even the way it's depicted here, it's so clearly scripted. It's so unnatural.
Okay, out there in Marveland, face front, this is Stan Lee speaking. You've probably never heard a record like this before, because no one would be nutty enough to make one with a bunch of offbeat artists, so anything is liable to happen.
Hey, who made you a disc jockey, Lee?
Well, Jolly Jack Kirby, say a few words to the fans, Jackson.
Okay, a few words.
Look, pal, I'll take care of the humor around here.
You've been using the same gags over and over for years.
Well, you can't accuse me of being fickle, can you?
Yeah, it's not like they were all comedians as their main job.
No, absolutely not. Another thing is that there's this idea presented here. Now, I'm going to mention Grant Morrison again. Grant Morrison in the 90s, would drop references to chaos magic and to putting desires out into the world and getting them back, and very much sort of a cool, edgier version of The Secret, basically. That's not what chaos magic is, I know. Please don't write us angry emails, but that's certainly how it came across to a lot of people, particularly when they talked about drawing a picture of a beautiful woman and that they wanted to be with, and they put that out into the world, and they were going to meet that person, and characters would appear in the Invisibles, which is the comic in the 90s. This is all preamble, don't worry. And then Grant met someone who looked just like this character they had put in the comic. Mm-hmm. So this idea of they had manifested somehow this individual to have a romance with. That very same idea is in here. That same idea, actually,
about Joan.
Yeah, and it's called back to once or twice that Stan Lee had drawn a depiction of Joan when he was a child.
Yeah, before he met her.
and again, this is where I was mentioning to you before the Peter David of it all. There's a sequence where Stanley travels back in time and meets his younger self, and they talk about this. They have a discussion about not just about Joan and the fact that this drawing of Joan will eventually lead him to Joan, but how to make a comic book. He's imparting to his younger self how to make a comic book in this sort of time travel sequence. It's a very curious, again, strange moment. Actually, this is the bit where he throws away Action Comics. I'm sorry. And then later on, after he's met Joan, after they've married, they've had a kid, all the rest of it, what sort of the stamp of approval for Dicko being replaced by Basima, isn't it?
Ramita.
Ramita, apologies. Is that Ramita draws Mary Jane in such a way that Stanley's like, oh, it looks a bit like Joan. You know, it's this idea.
Right. Well, when we haven't even gotten to Spider-Man yet, and we see Stan meeting Joan for the first time, and it's drawn just like the first appearance of Mary Jane.
Yes. Yes. And it's called back to the
yeah, and we see the real Mary Jane panel quite a bit later in the book, but they're assuming that anybody who's reading this book, well, unless they're only a movie fan, maybe not, but any comics fan is going to recognize the reference there. Yes.
And I do wonder when the first edition of this came out, but because I think this came out before he died.
I think it's 2015, if I remember right.
Yeah, and then it was reissued to make a note of his passing. But
copyright 2015.
Yeah, I was struck by that sort of the Grant Morrison of it all, and I did wonder if David was maybe just cribbing notes and trying to channel that sort of chaotic energy into this work, because it felt unusual.
Any other points we need to hit here?
I don't know. I think I am fascinated by the emphasis on the Marvel Studio movies. It figures large in this work, and there's sort of a calling forward to it. Early on in the comic, there are sort of allusions to Thor. There's allusions to Chris Hemsworth as Thor appears a couple of times, vanquishing the television version of Thor as inadequate. And there's a little call forwards to... There's a strange... Okay, I don't understand this. Okay, so... Again, we're talking about Marvel Entertainment here, I guess. But there is a page sort of talking about the Incredible Hulk television series being, from the 80s, being, crap. He's being very dismissive of it. Oh yeah, it's just silly. It's studio interference.
Well, he is. I don't know that he is too hard on that, but on the Spider-Man series of the 70s, which was not as successful, then he's complaining. They left out the humor, the human interest, the personality. Which, having seen that show as a kid, I think I'd have to agree with. It was a disappointing show, and I've usually blamed that at least partly on where the special effects technology was at the time, that they really couldn't do most of his actual villains. But he was always just fighting guys in suits, basically, and he'd climb a wall now and then, and that was about it.
Yeah, he's initially kinder to Incredible Hulk, the Incredible Hulk show, but
an
an
engrossing show for adult audiences without losing the younger fans, he says.
But then he says things went downhill from there, especially when they tried to use the Hulk to springboard other Marvel heroes, which is where we are introduced to this notion of the inadequate Thor, and Chris Hemsworth appears.
Yeah, so this Thor became a reincarnated Viking warrior. I don't even remember that show.
I remember that. Well, no, it wasn't a Thor show. It was the Hulk. So Thor is in Hulk.
Oh, he showed up in Hulk. Okay, yeah. I was never very crazy about the Hulk show either. I only ended up watching it when my sister had it on.
Yeah, the Daredevil was in it too.
Huh. Did not know that.
I think John Rhys Davies played the villain, if I remember correctly. But after all this is what I was building to. After all this sort of, gentle digs at the failure of the television shows to live up to his imagination or his idea of what they could be, which again, like, what do you mean? We've got this little bit with Agent Coulson from Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but at least we can feel good about Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter. Be happy with what you've got. Which I assume he's referring to the fact that, Agent Carter got cancelled. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has just finished up, I think, but it lasted a couple of seasons. Like, it 5 seasons maybe? I'm not really sure what that's about. I'm not really sure. He's clearly drawing a comparison between the 1980s television stuff with the contemporary television stuff. Oh, is he saying, "Oh, this is so much better"?
That's what I'm getting from it.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was just a bit lost by that. What are you trying to say? It's a bit odd.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't talked about Doran's art a lot, but I think she's an incredible artist. She's gifted at doing everything from caricature to almost photorealist style. She's certainly very flattering to Stan in terms of how she depicts him. But some people don't come off as well. There's a very, I thought, unflattering depiction of Len Wein in this.
Len Wein, where was that?
When they're talking about the Iron Man with the nose.
Oh, yeah, when Wein was at Marvel.
That was odd. It looked a bit like Sergio Aragona's style almost. I wasn't quite sure why that was. Has he? I don't know. Is there a sort of a reference there I'm missing again, or is it just they just decided to depict Len in this way?
Where he's got an afro and a beard. I mean, I wouldn't recognize him. I don't really know what Len Wein looks like, but or looked like at the time. Well, I don't know. Yeah, it does. Just with the beard and everything, he does look a little bit more kind of comic, cartoony, I could say, than Stan does, for example.
Exactly, and even though Stan is being depicted, with clouds of anger piping out of his ears, there's this sense of him being cartoonish himself. In contrast to that, Roy Thomas is depicted very flatteringly. he looks like he's posing. He's got his author photo shoot done. I'm a young biker dude of letters.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it has to do with the type of scene where the sequence about the Iron Man nose. Although the African American woman in that scene comes out a little better. I mean, she's not portrayed as a cartoony character like Ween or the guy who's on the phone. I don't know who that is.
Was it Friedrich? Mike Friedrich. Yeah. So, Mike Friedrich. Yeah, he's again somewhat cartoonish, but yeah, Len gets the brunt of it for some reason. I don't think we should be speculating. I don't think there's any intentions here, but it's just odd shifts in style almost. But yes, when Roy Thomas is introduced with the Conan the Barbarian,
then it's like a portrait.
Oh my God, it's very flattering. It's very flattering, but also Roy is known principally for being Stan's guy. He's the gatekeeper for the legacy, if you like. I think that's a fair comment. I don't think anyone would find that controversial. But I think it's fascinating to me that he's immediately introduced here with the coup of snatching of the rights to Conan. And what I only recently discovered was that it was Thomas who basically, Roy Thomas, who snapped up all the licensing rights to anything he could get his hands on, including Star Wars. But any sort of movie that was coming out, like, I wonder if he's the reason why they had run Space Knight, which didn't quite take off the way they thought it would.
Yeah.
But like any sort of IP.
Micronauts,
again. Yeah, another one.
I think Shogun Warriors, I think they had that too.
Oh my god. Like, there was like Care Bears and stuff like that. I remember there was all sorts of
weird, you get into
Marvel
the 80s
comics.
and yeah.
Yeah. So like, is that seems to be what's attractive about him to Stan, is that he's got a sense for the business. He's got a sense for like sitting all these properties and bring them under our Marvel umbrella, and then we've got ourselves something we can market. And doesn't that thematically tie all of this together? Because isn't this all building to the presentation of POW as a valid corporate entity within the comics world, the next stage in Stan's long career? Stan associating himself with Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, like they're rendered quite photorealistically in this book by Colleen Doran. So there's a sense of him bringing these movies into the world, even though again, like, they took off once he was no longer involved in the process. That's when the movies became successful.
But he was in all of them.
he got into them. He got into them because A.V. Arad, very cleverly, was like going, people like this character of Stan Lee. Get him in the movies. And I'm sure that's why Bryan Singer earns such a commendation here, because I think, because he wasn't in Blade. I don't believe Stan Lee was in Blade, but he was in the X-Men movie. And that was the next one they did. Because it was Blade and then X-Men. And X-Men is the one that everyone remembers kicking off the Marvel Renaissance on the big screen. But Blade was the one that actually laid the groundwork and was a huge success in its own right, and still holds up. Whereas X-Men, I think even at the time, I remember friends saying to me, "This isn't good." And I said, "No, you guys, you don't get it. You don't get X-Men. Oh, it's so clever, you guys. It's a metaphor, you see. Yeah, it's a metaphor." And then I think I watched it a few years later and I was like, "Oh, this is bad. This is a bad movie." Bryan Singer is a very pedestrian filmmaker, as well as a creep.
Yeah, speaking of that point, I don't know, this is a really minor thing, but I noticed it. Anachronistic language. When these college kids pick up Stan to take him to a college speech, and it's probably the 60s or 70s, and they're arguing about whether the mutants and the X-Men represent blacks or gays, and one guy says, "They're youngsters who realize when they're teens that they're different. How gay is that?" Now, using how something is that as a rhetorical question, I don't think anybody was doing that then. That's something I associate with like late 80s or 90s onward. But yeah, I never heard that when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's a rough little moment, and I think we've got Mr. David to thank for that. A man who's been known to put his foot in it.
Also, I thought
certain minority groups. Let's just put it that way.
Flo Steinberg looks a little too modern, the way she's dressed. I did buy her as being someone of the late 60s.
I could go either way in that. I mean, I've seen some of Trina Robbins's photography from the period when she's doing her fashion stuff, and there were some very hip people around at the time. She's got a bit of a Flo has a bit of the. I'm trying to remember the American actress. She was in all the French. She was in all the French films. She was in Paul Belmondo. Breathless. It'll come to me. Anyway, but she looks a bit. You're right. She looks a bit like Winona Ryder. It's not the most immediate point of reference. Yeah. Do you think that this is them sort of trying to make it more accessible to a contemporary reader? Is that what you think?
I don't know. I think it's difficult to write something that happens decades in the past without doing something anachronistic in it. I mean, I've heard before about how like some lines in Mad Men or whatever were anachronistic for the 60s. Nobody would have said it that way then. So yeah, I don't think there was any like conscious effort to make it look not like the time period it was supposed to be. But
the actress I was trying to think of was Jean Seberg.
Okay.
Because of the hair bob. That's what I was trying to think of. But yeah, like it is them being sort of young and how old was she at that time?
Oh, geez, I have no idea.
Yeah, like I think because Stan in this period, he's already in his late 30s, right?
Well, I mean, he was a teenager.
No, she'd be in his
late
40s.
30s. So,
Yeah,
late 1930s. 40s. So yeah, by the 70s, he's in his 40s or 50s.
Yeah. So yeah, he's being portrayed as. I know he had a lot of energy, and I know that he, sort of had a lot of get up and go. But like he's being presented as a very dynamic figure. These scenes.
Yeah, always.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a reference to Joan cutting the back of his hair, has me to a barber, and it's like, yeah, you wear a wig, dude. Yeah, what did you think of the sequence where Joan writes her the Pleasure Palace novel?
Well, I was like, okay, this feels like kind of promotion because it's not about Stan here, it's about Joan. And this is supposed to be a book about Stan. But then he plugs his own book in it too. Stan Lee how to make comics or something. There's a whole page devoted Stan Lee's How to Write Comics. And he must have the rights to those. He's back on stage on this page, and he's handing it over to some kid as a free gift, and then everybody else in the audience wants it too.
Yeah, and what follows is a very loose summary of how to create something, how to analyze storytelling and write your own stories, and basically seems to be just do what makes you feel good and see what happens. As writerly advice, it's a bit okay.
Well, and then his advice to pay attention to like movies and TV shows and think about how analyze everything that's on the screen. And of course, the movie that he's watching on this page is a Captain America movie.
Winter Soldier. Yeah. Why was Act 3 so much shorter than Act 2? And it's again. The one person you don't want to be listening to for advice on movie making is Stan Lee. Because he could take a good meeting, but after that, couldn't really close the deal.
So many projects that never happened. All right. Well, so would you recommend this book, and why, or why not?
This is much easier to find than the Excelsior book that Stan Lee wrote with George Mayer. So if you need to read a flattering account of Stan Lee's life, you can certainly get a hold of this one. It's a curio. It's a very strange version of the Stan Lee life. It's two people, as I said before, Peter David and Colleen Doran, more or less interpreting what it must feel like to listen to a series of Stan Lee anecdotes. I think that's the best way to describe this. I found it a bit off-putting. I found the sort of vanishing and disappearing of various antagonists in Stan Lee's life a bit, it was troubling for me reading this.
Yeah.
And we've described those sequences already, so we don't need to rehash them.
Right. He doesn't take the blame for anything that maybe he could have taken blame for, according to the other books we've read.
And again, for somebody who opens the proceedings by talking about, I used to be embarrassed about making comic books, and now look at how successful I am because of them. It turns out I was wrong. But so much of this book is associated with movies and celebrity, and that clearly rates as more important than whatever these stories were trying to tell people, or whatever these artists were bringing to bear on Stan Lee's vision, if you want to call it that. Like the creative work of Marvel doesn't really get a look in here, I don't think. Do you think that's fair? Like it's more about the commercial success of Marvel. That's what matters.
Yeah, that sounds. I mean, there are little things like the nose on Iron Man, but that's kind of a jokey sequence. But yeah, you're right about certainly the celebrity aspect of it, and we got the Clintons, we got Paul McCartney popping up. And of course, Paul McCartney. I mean, I know that he has talked about being a Marvel Comics fan for many years. But yeah, I mean, we just had to get the celebrities in here, the reflected glory. It feels kind of like a validation of Stan. Like these celebrities dig Stan. So,
but isn't there a famous photograph of Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney with Jack Kirby, and they're awed by him. You can see it in the photo. They're really excited, and Jack Kirby just looks at, what are you gonna do? This young moppet-haired twerp is impressed by me, apparently.
Oh yeah, I just found the pictures. It shows them talking with him,
and they're smiling, like they're really happy, and. In this version of events, I'm not saying it never happened, but in this telling, Lee meets McCartney, and McCartney wants him to do a comic book character based on Linda, but then she dies, so it never happens. But I was going, wait, when did this happen?
Yeah, I was surprised it was that late, because she died in the 90s, and I thought I was reading something that happened in the 70s.
Exactly my point. So it took you 20 years to maybe come up with a Linda McCartney comic book, and then you didn't. It's very odd.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting book, an easy read. But yeah, I agree. There are, having read the other books, there are some aspects that are kind of disturbing. How he's kind of washing his hands of Kirby and Ditko leaving, and the original artwork bit and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you really want to get Stan's side of the story, you can read this, or you can read Excelsior, which we're going to do next.
And if someone out there listening to this, if you ever find yourself in an elevator with Peter David, could you please ask him to explain the Beauty and the Beast Ron Perlman bit? Because I'm flummoxed.
Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible, A Marvelous Memoir is published by Simon & Schuster. This is our 700th episode of Deconstructing Comics. It's taken us 15 and a half years to get here, and thanks for continuing to listen. There have been so many interesting things that have happened over that time, and so much has changed. We've had so many well-known creators on this show, from Peter David to Dan Jurgens, from Chris Bachalo to Alex Robinson, from Mark Russell to Ted Rall. I've been sharing a lot of these classic episodes on Twitter and Facebook over the past week or so go back and take a look. But I'd also like to play a few clips this time of some past episodes that come to mind as some podcast highlights. One of my favorite reviews that we've done was of the manga Death Note in episode 224 back in 2010. We chose a point of the series that would be the cutoff point for what we could talk about in the first half of the episode. Then we gave a spoiler warning and talked about the entire series for the second half.
This series is very low on action for a Shonen Jump series. It's very unusual because those Shonen Jump series are always about jumping around and fighting and stuff. And this is just talking, and not even talking, this is about thinking. Because often there's cameras and listening devices surrounding suspects. So, they can only think. All you get is these captions of thoughts, pages and pages of people thinking. It's totally unusual for Shonen Jump. But the other point about Shonen Jump was this is, it's supposed to be, it's actually kind of, it subverts the shonen manga genre completely because shonen is about friendship and perseverance, but his perseverance is trying not to get caught. It is in a sense, if you just plug in all of the checklists of the things you're supposed to do in a shonen manga, he does all of them. But for completely wrong, immoral reasons. And yet somehow it still fits in that Shonen Jump checklist, if you know what I mean. So I find it's very interesting that it was in that magazine, because it's not like anything else in there, and yet it is exactly the same at the same time.
Yeah, I was thinking... I'd expected it to be something like 100 Bullets. It's sort of like 100 Bullets with unlimited bullets and incorporating an extreme and reckless take on Plato's Republic. Well, I thought of that because what I remember of Plato's Republic from however many decades ago I read it,
right.
It's like making a perfect society and deciding who's going to get to reproduce and who's not.
Right.
This is more extreme. Just wipe out the people that aren't part of the perfect society.
And he was like pro-slavery in that too, wasn't he?
Perhaps. I don't remember.
Yeah. I always, as you know, I always mix up my Greek philosophers on these podcasts. And one of them was really pro-slavery.
In 2009, I had the inspiration to get Mo Willems on the show. It had dawned on me that he was really doing comics. They just looked like children's picture books. He said that was his dirty little secret. I wasn't even sure I could get that big of a name on the show at the time, and it was especially intimidating that the email domain of his publicist was Disney.com. But he did come on episode 165 for a great conversation.
Yeah, so was it a conscious choice of yours to do the children's books really as kind of stealth comics?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. I come from television, and I come from having done panels, single panel cartoons, and I did some alternative comic book stuff. There was a collective in the 90s of animators in New York called Monkey Suit, and I was loosely involved with those guys. And I did do some stuff for DC, some stuff that was published, some stuff that wasn't. So, that was sort of the vernacular that I was used to. And, my hero, of course, I think everybody's hero is Charles Schulz. And I really wanted to be a cartoonist. I mean, from a very early age, when I was 5, I wrote Schultz a letter saying, "Can I have your job when you're dead?"
Aha! Did he write back?
No, my father never sent it.
I see. Okay.
but it did come full circle because I've recently become buddies with his widow and was hanging out at the museum. I don't know, a couple of years ago now, and out of that experience, I got one of his nibs, which was a very cool thing to have, and I used that nib to draw my latest book, The Naked Mole Rat Gets Dressed. And I also got to write the introduction for one of the anthologies that came out recently, and that was a real thrill for me.
So is that why you know Paige then?
That's how I met Paige. I think Paige actually was the person who snuck me the nib while security wasn't looking.
Okay. Yeah, so I thought to bring this up because, really in terms of like periodical traditional periodical comics in the States these days, there are hardly any that are aimed at kids. You know, the comics that I read when I was a kid, Harvey and the Gold Key and that kind of stuff, they went out of business a long time ago.
Yeah, I used to read Gold Key stuff. We used to go to what was it called? Was it Stuckey's, or there was some sort of line of roadside joints in the South, and you get Stuckey's. 3 for whatever. No, and certainly there was less room for me in those traditional mediums. One, because I'm not really dirty. You know, I've done a little bit of stuff for Mad and Mad Kids, but it was, I'm not really dirty, and I'm not really topical. I'm not looking at the contemporary fate of pigeons in the post-Obama world. I'm just not.
Yeah.
So I had, when I did a TV show for Cartoon Network that was a really spectacular failure. But my rule was that everything had to be funny to a 10-year-old and funny in 10 years. And in television, that's too long of a shelf life. And I think in books, it's a medium that people are willing to buy something. It doesn't have to be hot off the presses to still have relevance.
So the show you're talking about, was that Sheep in the Big City?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some of that. I thought it was pretty funny myself, the puns and so forth.
Well, yeah, I thought it was funny, and you did. I think there's a dental hygienist in Ohio that did,
okay.
And she tattooed sheep on her butt. But that, what happens every time I go to a book signing now? There are hundreds of kids and parents, and then the whole group sort of fans out, and there's always this one awkward teen in the back, and it's my sheep fan.
Uh-huh.
And I love seeing my sheep fan. So it's nice to know that there's one in every town. It's sort of like having a fan in every port.
Yeah, even Tokyo.
Yeah.
Why did I think those Skype headphones had a good mic? Anyway, in another 2009 episode, number 173, I decided to act as a reporter after hearing so much complaining about Diamond Distribution raising the sales threshold that titles had to meet to be listed in Diamond previews. Was Diamond being evil, or was the adjustment necessary for their business? I talked with a Diamond rep, a comics retailer, and 2 publishers, and edited together clips from the interviews along with my voiceover. It was fun, but of course it took more time than usual.
Hibbs states more strongly that Diamond has been very careful to avoid being the bad guy, at least to the extent you can with no real competitor. In fact, he says, this led Diamond to perhaps make it too easy to get a comic distributed, regardless of quality.
Part of sort of the deeper background that you've got to understand here is that when Diamond went exclusive with DC in, I want to say 96, I believe it was 96, Diamond was put in a position where they were really afraid, kind of, I want to say politically, that they were going to look like the big bad wolf, and that they really felt like they needed to open the marketplace to anybody who came, and that they would accept virtually anything that was being offered to them as a comic. Because of that lack of aesthetic oversight, let's say, an awful lot of stuff was getting published that probably shouldn't have been published in the first place. So Diamond was distributing an awful lot of books that were very marginal quality and even smaller audience interest. And so, we did get a very bloated catalog as a result of that, but Diamond never wanted to look like the bad guy in any of this.
Bill Shanus of Diamond concurs that it's been very easy to get a comic published and distributed, much easier than it would be in most other media, in part because the overhead is quite low, maybe too low.
We looked at many different industries as far as what their profitability benchmarks are, and we're a fraction of the least one we could find.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, records or videos, those numbers are huge. And because most of the folks, the guys and gals that draw the comics or print the comics that are what we call small press, are normally a husband or wife or a team of friends together, and they're working out of their house. Their cost of the product is their drawing time and their writing time, and the actual print. So really, their labor of love has really not a lot of heavy-duty financial costs. So they're not out much money except for their time and energy.
More recently, in episode 595, we had the unusual situation where the paths of two of our globally dispersed cast of regulars happened to cross at TCAF 2018. Coombe was there interviewing tablers, and Mulele was there to table. Unfortunately, one of his boxes of merchandise didn't get where it was going, so he couldn't sell the stuff. Here, Coombe asked him about selling at TCAF.
Yeah, actually, most of the money that I made was made yesterday. I mean, today wasn't bad, but yesterday was very good.
Yeah, yesterday was insanely busy.
Yeah. But yesterday there was kind of like a panic run to get all of the books from all of the artists that you wanted to see first. And then today was kind of, there's a lot of second look traffic where people kind of floated in. It's like, okay, I saw this before and I was curious, now let me check it out. But
that's funny because for cheap bastards like myself, today is the day because like people want to like sell stuff off.
Yeah,
and then you're like, yeah, okay, let's make a deal.
Of course, I have to mention Tom Spurgeon, the comics maven who blogged at comicsreporter.com and appeared on this show many times. That was usually via phone or Skype, but in 2017 I went to Columbus, Ohio, and interviewed him at his workplace, the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at Ohio State University. That day produced a fantastic photo of me with Tom, Durf, Steve Bissett, and Steve's associate Craig Fisher. Steve and Craig happened to be at the Billy Ireland to do research. I did interviews with all of them that day. Durf appeared in episode 568 and everyone else in episode 564. Here's a bit of my talk with Tom.
And this, later on they can work with publishers. Later on they can work with people that will take a lot of this out of their hands. But I think understanding that with your first few books, these like homemade books as you're making your name, I think it really helps them later on. I think it really helps them to know that to not have a publisher or not have a set of publishers keep it a mystery from you how things are done. And that if you have to, you can always find a way to express yourself that doesn't depend on someone else's permission. Comics Low Threshold is one of its great strengths, and we make fun of it sometimes, but it's really wonderful that you can just start making comics and going to shows, and we will probably find out about you within 6 months or 8 months. Because everyone talks and puts things online and gets excited about things they see. And, you can't do that with film. There's a lot of gatekeeping in film. There's some gatekeeping in to a significant amount of books in the book industry. And comics, you can spend a portion of your entire career. John Porcelino is coming this year, the wonderful, kind of the Johnny Appleseed of American mini comics. And great supporter of other people's work at the early handmade stage, as well as basically his primary mode of creating is still doing handmade mini comics and sending them out. And there's nothing less artistic about his work that he chooses to publish that way. And that's a huge, huge thing of value for comics. And while commercial comics are a wonderful thing, I wish more comics were more commercial. I would love more millionaire cartoonists. I just think that if you look back, we'll be able to look back 50, 100, 200 years from now at this kind of wave of handmade comics and people just trying to express themselves. And I think we're going to get more and more artists that kind of stay in comics for a little while and then go write TV shows or go back into animation or whatever. And so just to have this kind of collection of work that you don't get with a playwright, you don't get to see the senior, you don't get to see who's an important actor of our time. You don't get to see Daniel Day-Lewis's high school production of 12 Angry Men, but I can get access to a lot of kid comics that Art Spiegelman made or here. They have a lot of them.
This stuff in the gallery like Will Eisner did when he was 6 years old or something.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. And when we get that in comics, and after a certain age, they even have kind of a shadow market that they follow that's a little different than the comics market, but part of it. So it's really excites me, and I really want to get those. I mean, going to a show and finding someone whose comics you like to look at and buying it from them and having that personal connection and going home and being blown away it's how I've met a lot of cartoonists over the years and discovered a lot of cartoonists that are personal to me now. And I think that's a great experience. But like I said, I think people are comfortable with it. I think they know that even if they're not dressing up like a zombie, they're probably going to a big room where they can buy things off of tables. I think people are kind of comfortable with that.
So who are the guests this year? I know Durf is kind of headlining.
Yeah, Durf is a real great friend of the show and was a special guest our first year. And we repeated him this year because he has the movie coming out, a movie version of My Friend Dahmer, his great graphic novel, is coming out. And it's the 40th anniversary of this facility, the Billy Ireland. And Durf was a student here and, learned about comics by coming down to the old Billy Ireland setup. What was it called? Not even that. It's called I forget what name it had at the time.
I mentioned it when I interviewed him.
Comic, cartoon, art, something. Maybe, or something. I bet whatever it was called at the time. Lucy Caswell's great library. So he's like a favorite son. He's like, that's everything that's good about this place is kind of exemplified in someone like Durf going off and having a really solid career. So we're very excited for him to have this movie, and we're going to preview it or show it exclusively or whatever the timing is, and Durf will speak. He's a wonderful speaker, and will speak before and after. And what's neat about that is not only do we get a great event, but I think Durf will very much enjoy kind of coming back to his alma mater with a film and kind of being able to speak to those matters. So Durf is very much an important guest for us.
Episode 564 is one of the episodes I shared recently on social media. Durf commented on it on Twitter, and I quote, "The @Decon Comics podcast just reposted this, an episode with the beloved Tom Spurgeon. I was down at the @Cartoon Library to do my own episode when this photo was taken. Great one with Tom. Hadn't listened to it before. He talks about me a bit. Here come the tears. Miss you, buddy. And all of us at Deconstructing Comics miss him too." One more. This podcast hasn't been known for its comedy, but if I do say so myself, the following from 2011 was one of the funniest bits in the history of this show. In episode 299, Kumar and Dana did a heavy metal-themed show, featuring Kiminori Wakasugi's Detroit Metal City versus Metalocalypse Dethklok, created by Brendan Small. This is how I handled the voiceover.
This is Tim. Thanks, guys, for picking up the slack for me this week. And by the way, no, I don't own Saint Anger. I own Def Magnetic. Heh. Huh, Metallica put out records in the 80s? Who knew? Anyway, at the top of the show, you heard the Dethklok intro. The music behind me now is from the Detroit Metal City movie, and it's called Satsugai, or Bloodshed. But enough of that. Much better.
To be fair, as I recall, the idea was partially Kumar's. I'll put links to all these episodes in the show notes. None of them are still in our feed, but as I mentioned at the top of the show and the middle of the show, one of our goals at patreon.com/deconcomics would unlock putting all the old episodes in our feed. You can help make it happen. Thanks for listening. Thanks also to JB Anderton for our theme song. Next week, Kumar and Dana discuss Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.